The overhead page crackled at 6:13 a.m., just as Hannah Clarke finished her shift report. Nightingale to Trauma Bay 4. Nightingale to Trauma Bay 4. The request wasn't urgent. The tone was mockery. She set down her pen without hurrying, her fingers steady despite the heat rising across her collarbone, a response her body remembered from interrogation training, the kind of discipline that no longer served a purpose but had nowhere else to go. Around the nurses' station, 3 residents smirked. One whispered something that made the others laugh. Hannah didn't look up. She'd learned in Tikrit that acknowledgement was a wound you gave them permission to keep opening. Seattle General in Raleigh had fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency that made her molars ache, and linoleum that hadn't been replaced since 2008. The smell was always the same, antiseptic underlaid with the ghost of old blood, the kind of institutional grey that came from 1,000 shifts bleeding together. She moved through the hallways at 6:30 every morning, arriving before the day's shift to prep her stations, to move through the world before it moved through her. The ER was hers in those minutes, the ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm undisturbed, the heart monitors beeped their lonely cadence into an empty room, and no one asked questions about the woman who limped slightly on cold mornings or carried herself like she was moving through a minefield. The scar above her left eyebrow was barely visible under her pulled-back hair. The ridge of keloid tissue on her forearm, where shrapnel from a Katyusha had torn through muscle tissue in the Jolan district of Fallujah, she kept covered with a compression sleeve she claimed was for carpal tunnel. Her file at Seattle General listed her as a civilian nurse with a certificate from Duke University Medical Center, 12 years of emergency medicine experience, and a reputation for glacial competence in crisis, the kind of nurse who never panicked, never froze, never needed to be told twice what a patient needed. What the file didn't mention was the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her scrub jacket, so far inside the seam that only she knew it was there. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Tikrit 2004 through 2007. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. The kind of history she'd buried under civilian credentials and careful silence, the kind of past that belonged to someone else. She'd learned to make herself small. Smaller than her competence. Smaller than what her hands could do. Smaller than the command voice that lived in her chest and needed to stay locked away because this was a hospital, not a phi base, and a trauma nurse who spoke like a major would be swiftly reminded that she was just staff. Hannah Clarke had gotten very good at being just staff. She'd gotten very good at the mechanical efficiency of rebuilding a life one for start at a time, one intubation at a time, one patient saved at midnight who'd never know her name. Her 17-year-old son, Marcus, thought she was depressed. Her physical therapist thought she was resistant to healing. Neither of them understood that the tremor in her hands that appeared only when she was alone, sitting in her car in the hospital parking garage at 2 a.m., staring at nothing, wasn't weakness. It was the sound a dam makes right before it breaks. The ER filled up the way it always did. By 7 a.m., the day shift had arrived in their staggered clusters, residents who'd been on call overnight with the hollow eyes of the sleep-deprived, nurses who moved with the automaticity of bodies running on coffee and habit, orderlies pushing stretchers that carried the city's broken and bleeding. Hannah had already done the work that no one saw, the prep, the supplies checked, the crash carts inventoried, the stations ready. She was filing medication logs at the central desk when the footsteps started, the kind of deliberate footsteps that belonged to someone who wanted to be heard arriving. Dr. Marcus Caldwell was tall in the way that photographs made a point of capturing, broad shoulders, the kind of jawline that could cut glass, dark hair with threading grey at the temples that made him look distinguished instead of aging. He wore a suit under his white coat, the suit visible beneath like he was too important for the standard hospital uniform, and his shoes were leather, good leather, the kind that made sounds on the linoleum floor like he owned the building. His eyes moved across the ER like he was appraising real estate, cataloguing inefficiencies and inadequacies, already planning the restructuring that would bear his name and his vision. He'd come from Johns Hopkins, where he'd spent 15 years climbing a hierarchy with the precision of a general planning a campaign. He'd been hired to modernize Seattle General's emergency department, which meant he'd been hired to make his mark, and the first mark any leader made was establishing that he was the one who decided things around here. The chief of medicine introduced him during morning rounds. Dr. Caldwell shook hands with an efficiency that looked like respect but felt like inventory. He listened to the night shift report with the expression of someone waiting for people to finish talking so he could explain how things actually worked. And then his eyes found Hannah Clarke standing at the back of the group, holding a tablet and listening to a resident explain a patient's declining renal function with the absent expression of someone who had already calculated 3 steps ahead. She was wearing scrubs that had been washed too many times, faded to the color of old sky. Her hair was pulled back with a surgical mask looped around it, a habit from the pandemic that she'd never broken. She had the kind of face that didn't invite attention, not pretty, not ugly, just competent. Just the background. She was listening to the resident with the kind of focus that Dr. Caldwell recognized as dangerous because he'd spent 15 years identifying the people in a room who actually knew what they were doing. The competent ones were always a threat. The competent ones didn't respect hierarchy because they'd learned that competence mattered more than rank. The competent ones questioned things. The competent ones got in the way of vision. He watched her move to a patient's bedside and adjust the ventilator settings with a single-hand gesture to the respiratory therapist, who jumped to comply before she even finished speaking. He watched her recognize a medication interaction that the prescribing resident had missed. He watched her do it all without announcing herself, without taking credit, without making a scene about it. Just the quiet competence of someone who knew she was right and didn't need praise to know it. That was the problem. The problem with the Hannah Clarkes of the world was that they made the hierarchy invisible. When someone like that was in the room, rank didn't matter. Authority didn't matter. Only competence mattered. And Dr. Caldwell had spent 15 years climbing a hierarchy based on the assumption that rank did matter, that authority did matter, that the right position at the right table meant that your words carried weight regardless of what you actually knew. The faded unit patch in her scrub jacket lining might as well have been screaming. He had no idea what it said. He couldn't see it. But he could smell military on her the way predators smell weakness on prey, not because she'd ever mentioned it, but because she carried herself like someone who'd moved through a world where consequences were fatal and decisions mattered and no one cared about your feelings while you were making them. That kind of bearing didn't come from nursing school. That kind of bearing came from somewhere else, somewhere harder, and it made her dangerous in ways that went deeper than clinical competence. At 8:15 a.m., the overhead page crackled to life. Dr. Caldwell had positioned himself at the central desk, making sure he was visible, making sure everyone knew it was him initiating the call. Nightingale to Trauma Bay 4. Nightingale to Trauma Bay 4, he said into the speaker, and his voice carried through the emergency department like oil spreading across water. Around the nurses' station, heads turned. Someone suppressed a laugh. A resident whispered something that made his colleagues' shoulders shake. The nickname wasn't new, nurses had code names, and Hannah's had been a nightingale for years, something about the way she appeared in rooms where patients were dying and somehow kept them alive. But the way he said it transformed the word. The way he said it was mockery. The way he said it was a demonstration of power, a public announcement that he was the kind of chief who could call people out over the page, who could reduce a nurse to a nickname, who could make the entire department complicit in the humiliation by making them all listen to it. Hannah didn't move immediately. She finished charting a medication on the tablet. She set the pen down. She registered the sound of suppressed laughter around her, the sudden awareness of dozens of eyes landing on her like a weight. The tremor that wanted to start in her hand she pushed down into her chest where it became something else, not fear, not anger, not humiliation. Just data. Just information. Just the recognition of a threat pattern and the mental calculation of response options. She'd been trained by the United States Marine Corps to function under threat. She'd been trained to recognize when someone was trying to establish dominance. She'd been trained to know the difference between a real tactical situation and a psychological one, and this was psychological. This was a man in a suit standing at a desk with a microphone, trying to see if he could make her flinch. She didn't flinch. She stood up. She moved toward Trauma Bay 4 with the same steady pace she always used, the same mechanical efficiency, the same absolute absence of reaction that would have been called composure if anyone had understood what composure actually was. In Tikrit, the men under her command had called it command presence. The ability to move through chaos like it was water and not drown. The ability to absorb a threat and continue the mission without hesitation. The ability to make everyone around you believe that whatever was happening next, you had already calculated 3 steps ahead and survived worse. The resident in Trauma Bay 4 was drawing blood from a patient with a bruised forearm that had probably been injured in a fall. Nothing urgent. Nothing that required a page. This was the point. This was the demonstration. This was Dr. Caldwell showing the staff that he could call people out for no reason, for any reason, just because he had a microphone and rank, and they had to comply. Hannah entered the bay without breaking stride. She approached the resident, glanced at the order on the monitor, assessed the patient's current status with a single look that took 3 seconds and included their oxygen saturation, their heart rate, their respiratory effort, their level of consciousness, and the 4 placement that was already in their arm. "You need a 21-gauge butterfly," she said to the resident. Not a question. Not a suggestion. Just information. The resident, a 3rd year who was probably terrified of the new chief, nodded and began the blood draw. Hannah moved to adjust the patient's pillows, to check the monitor leads, to do the work that would never be listed on any chart but that kept people alive anyway. "Just a routine draw," the resident offered, something like an apology in his voice. "I know," Hannah said. She smiled at the patient, an old man with cataracts and the confused expression of someone in a hospital bed. "We'll get you comfortable." The word Nightingale had landed exactly where he'd intended it to land, in that space where a person's competence became visible and therefore became a threat. But Hannah had learned in Tikrit that threats were everywhere, that humiliation was a tool, and that the only power worth having was the kind that didn't need to announce itself over a microphone. She'd learned that the people who survived were the ones who could absorb a hit and keep moving. The ones who could be called out in front of the entire department and continue their work like they'd heard nothing. The ones who understood that the real power wasn't in being noticed. It was in being necessary. The blood draw took 90 seconds. Hannah stayed with the patient while it was done, murmuring something low and steady that made the old man relax his grip on the bed rail. When the resident finished, she adjusted the bandage and stepped back, her hand still steady, her breathing unchanged, her presence like a weight that had settled and was never moving again. She'd absorbed the page, the mockery, the humiliation, and transformed it into exactly nothing. She'd turned herself into a background detail in her own story, the kind of person who solved problems and disappeared, who existed in the space between what was broken and what was fixed and asked nothing in return. As she walked back toward the nurse's station, Dr. Caldwell watched from his position at the desk. He was smiling. He'd gotten exactly what he was looking for, a chance to establish dominance, to remind everyone that hierarchy mattered, to prove that he could call attention to someone and make them answer. But he'd missed something. He'd missed the fact that Hannah hadn't flinched. He'd missed the fact that her composure had been the response, not her humiliation. He'd missed the fact that in trying to break her with the word "a nightingale," he'd actually revealed something, that she was the kind of person who could absorb a hit in front of 100 people and not even blink. That was the kind of composure that didn't come from nursing school. That was the kind of composure that came from somewhere much harder, much darker, somewhere that most people never went and fewer people ever came back from. The supply closet reeked of antiseptic and expired for fluids. Dr. Caldwell closed the door behind him with the precision of a man who had calculated every detail of this moment. Hannah stood with her hands flat against the metal shelf, her uniform still damp from a 12-hour shift, completely unaware that she was about to be dismantled with paperwork and threat. "I've been reviewing medication counts," Dr. Caldwell said. His voice carried the texture of a man accustomed to obedience. "Discrepancies? On your shift specifically?" He stepped closer, his cologne mixing with the chemical smell of cleaning solution. 3 instances. Morphine, fentanyl, midazolam. We're talking about grounds for termination. License review. DEA involvement. Hannah turned. Her hands remained steady. Her eyes met his without hesitation, and that was the first sign that Dr. Caldwell had miscalculated something fundamental about this woman. "I document every dose," she said. "Check the wastage logs." The logs matched the counts. He smiled. It was a predator's smile. "Which is the problem?" They shouldn't. Not perfectly. It makes you look careless. Or worse. Worse. Dishonest. He let the word hang in the fluorescent-lit space between them. Hospital policy is clear. Any discrepancy investigation results in immediate suspension pending findings. That means no floor privileges, no trauma bays, no patient contact. It means your medical license gets flagged with the state board. It means nursing homes and clinics, if anyone hires you at all. Hannah didn't blink. Not once. Her jaw tightened, a single muscle ripple at her angle, visible only to someone watching carefully, but when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. The counts are accurate because I'm careful. Are you? Dr. Caldwell moved closer. He wanted her to step back. He wanted submission. Or are you just lucky? Because luck runs out, Nurse Clarke. Luck and incompetence both eventually show their faces. A single tear escaped Hannah's left eye. Just one. It tracked down her cheek with the inevitability of a perfectly calibrated drop of water. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her hand rose, steady as a surgical instrument, and wiped the tear away with the back of her thumb without breaking eye contact. I've served under worse than you, she said quietly, and survived. Dr. Caldwell's jaw tightened because he recognized, in that moment, that her composure was a kind of armor he couldn't breach. Her dignity made his cruelty look small. Made it look desperate. That was worse than anger. That was worse than tears. He'd expected rage or fear, and instead he'd found something that made him realize he'd already lost control of the narrative before it began. But he smiled anyway. Because he'd already made the calls. Friday evening, as the night shift was arriving and the parking lot was full of witnesses, Dr. Caldwell found her walking toward her Honda Civic. The sun was bleeding orange into the clouds above Seattle General, and the air had that particular smell of rain about to fall. He raised his voice. He made sure the new arrivals heard every word. Nurse Clarke. A public address, calculated and cruel. 15 staff members turned. Stretcher crews paused mid-transfer. Effective immediately, you're reassigned. Triage-only duties. No trauma bays. Your privileges are revoked. Hannah stopped. Her service training held her spine straight. Her shoulders didn't drop. Her eyes didn't flood. She stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to register the humiliation, long enough for the whispers to start, and then she walked to her car without a word. Not even a glance backward. Her composure was like a knife held perfectly still. It cut deeper than any scream could have. Dr. Caldwell watched from the parking lot, his hands in his pockets, already running through his next moves in his mind. A performance review with board members. 3 of them owed him favors. Their board member credentials were worth more than Hannah's nursing license. He'd have her paperwork flagged within the week. By the time she understood what was happening, she'd already be gone. He didn't know, of course, that Saturday afternoon was going to arrive with the kind of patient that would change everything. The ambulance bay erupted at 2:38 p.m. Military police vehicles. 3 of them. Lights flashing red and blue across the white concrete, the kind of official chaos that made every doctor in the building stand up from their desks. Hannah was at triage, the place Dr. Caldwell had exiled her to, the lowest rank in the trauma hierarchy, when she saw the stretcher come through. A gray-haired man in civilian clothes, blood soaking through his shirt, 2 puncture wounds in his upper left quadrant. MPs in full tactical gear, hands on weapons, eyes scanning the hospital like it was hostile territory. Gunshot wound, center mass, lost pulse in transport, 2 minutes of CPR, the senior MP barked. He needs trauma now. Dr. Caldwell emerged from his office like a shark following blood in the water. His eyes lit up. High-profile case. Military patient. This was the kind of case that looked good in the performance review narratives he'd be writing for the board. Trauma 1, immediately. Surgery standby. And get her away from my scene. He pointed at Hannah without looking at her. Triage only. You stay here. The team swept past her. The stretcher disappeared into Trauma 1. The glass partition between triage and the trauma bay was transparent enough that Hannah could see everything, the resident with trembling hands on the defibrillator pads, the monitor showing VFib, the attending barking orders, Dr. Caldwell standing in the corner with his arms crossed, supervising like a vulture watching prey. She saw the problem before anyone else did. The chest wound had reopened. Blood pooling in the thoracic cavity. The patient was in tension pneumothorax, the lungs compressing, no room to expand, the heart squeezing in a chest full of blood while they shocked a heart that had nothing to pump. They were treating the rhythm instead of the patient. They were going to kill him by the textbook. Her hands gripped the triage desk. Her knuckles went white. She watched the resident charge the defibrillator again. Third shock. Fourth. The monitor showed flat line. The resident looked at the attending. The attending looked at his watch. Someone called time of death. 2:52 p.m. Hannah's feet moved before her brain could catch up. She was through the trauma bay doors, her hands already on the patient's exposed chest, pushing past Dr. Caldwell, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Tension hemothorax. He's got a collapsed left lung and he's drowning internally. You're shocking a dry heart. Security. Dr. Caldwell's face went purple. Get her out of here. Now. But Hannah's hands were already moving. She didn't ask for instruments. She didn't wait for permission. She moved like someone who had done this before, in a place where permission meant nothing and speed meant survival. She reached into the tactical medical kit on the stretcher, because of course an MP-escorted patient came with an aid bag, and found what she needed. An MRE packet. Foil. Plastic. The kind of thing field medics used when there was no time for sterile field dressings. She tore it open with her teeth. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had improvised life-saving measures in Tikrit with nothing but what was in her pack. Step back, she said to the resident. Not a request. A command. It wasn't a request, it was a command, and the resident obeyed the tone of authority before he even understood why. She fashioned a chest seal from the MRE packaging. Her fingers worked with surgical precision, taping a three-sided seal over the wound entry point while Dr. Caldwell stood frozen in the corner of the room, watching a trauma nurse do something he'd never seen in a medical textbook. The seal was good. Better than good. It was the kind of improvisation that only came from having done it under fire. Draw up epi, she barked at the pharmacy tech. 1 milligram for push. The tech moved. She placed her hand flat over the patient's sternum. Resume chest compressions. 30 and 2. You don't have authority here, Dr. Caldwell said. Hannah didn't even look at him. Start compressions. The room obeyed. The monitor beeped once. Twice. A rhythm emerged. Not perfect. But real. The patient's chest rose and fell with each compression. The line climbed. 60. 70. 80. Get him to OR, Hannah said. Resuscitative thoracotomy kit prepped. He's got massive bleeding. You've got maybe 6 minutes before he codes again. The trauma attending stared at her for 1 second that felt like an eternity. He didn't know who this woman was. He didn't know she had 3 field medicine certifications he'd never see on a resume. He only knew that the patient was alive, and the monitor was showing something other than flatline, and this woman's hands had done what nobody in his trauma bay could have done. Go, he said to the surgical team. Move. Now. The stretcher rolled. The trauma bay erupted into organized chaos. Hannah stepped back. Her hands dropped to her sides. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes were completely dry. She turned to face Dr. Caldwell. The power dynamic in the room had shifted on its axis. But that wasn't the worst part. Because the senior MP who had brought the patient in, the man with his hand still on his service weapon, had heard every word of that exchange. He'd watched her work. He'd seen the patient go from dead to alive. And he was reaching for his phone with an expression that suggested he was about to make a call that would change everything. The ambulance bay doors shudder open and lights flood the triage station, red and blue strobes painting the walls like a warning. Hannah looks up from her computer screen where she'd been processing intake forms for the last 2 hours, a task so far beneath her skill set that it felt like penance. Military police vehicles. 3 of them. Black Hawks don't land in hospital parking lots without reason, and neither do the men who ride in them. Her pulse doesn't change. That's the thing about 17 years of service, your body learns the difference between adrenaline and actual danger. This is both. A protective detail. A VIP patient. Which means she'll be watching from triage while someone else handles the save. The stretcher crashes through the ER doors like something from a combat zone extraction, boots thundering on linoleum, shouts overlapping in that particular cadence of organized emergency. The patient is grey-faced, chest heaving with the irregular rhythm of someone whose heart is still trying to remember how to beat. His suit is navy, expensive. His tie is soaked in blood. 2 MPs flank the stretcher in formation, hands resting on holstered sidearms like they're protecting something worth dying for. The lead officer is shouting vitals at the trauma team, 73-year-old male, blunt force thoracic trauma, cardiac arrest in the field, on compressions for 7 minutes, got a pulse back 5 minutes ago but it's fragile, extremely fragile. Dr. Caldwell emerges from the physician's lounge like he's been waiting for this exact moment. He's moving toward Trauma Bay 1 with the confidence of a man who's never had to improvise in his life. The surgical lights are already warming. Someone is cross-matching blood. The machinery of American emergency medicine is grinding into motion, all protocols and hierarchy and the comfortable assumption that everyone knows what they're doing. Except the moment Hannah sees the patient's chest wound, something in her recognition fires. The bleeding isn't slowing. The tape they've applied is already soaked through. That's not venous bleeding, that's pressure building behind the sternum. Tension hemothorax. The kind that kills you not because of what you lost, but because of what's compressing your heart. Hannah is supposed to be in triage. Dr. Caldwell made that very clear in the parking lot yesterday, his voice cutting sharp enough that the entire night shift heard exactly how far her authority had been reduced. Triage only. Don't touch patients. Don't touch supplies. Don't breathe without permission. She stands anyway. The trauma team doesn't notice her at first because they're doing what they're trained to do, standard protocol, methodical steps, believing that the system will work because the system always works. But Hannah has worked under fire, quite literally, and fire doesn't care about protocols. One of the MPs sees her moving toward the tactical bag they brought with the patient. His hand flexes. Instinct. She nods once, the kind of small movement that says I know your rules and I'm breaking them anyway. The MP nods back because his job isn't to stop a nurse, his job is to keep his commanding officer alive. Hannah opens the bag and finds what she expected, standard issue. Combat gauze. Tourniquets. And an MRE packet, the green one, looks like beef stew, the kind that's been in circulation since 2008. She rips it open with 2 fingers, fast and efficient, discards the contents on the sterile field without ceremony. The plastic packaging is thick military-grade material, designed to survive everything short of direct fire. It'll work. Betadine. Now. Her voice isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It's the kind of voice that's given orders at 3 in the morning while helicopters were landing under sniper fire. A seasoned trauma nurse whose name tag reads Williams hands her the bottle without question, without hesitation, without checking with Dr. Caldwell first. That's what authority sounds like when it's burned into someone's spine, not asking, not requesting, just knowing. Hannah's hands move. They don't shake. They don't hesitate. They perform the same assessment she's performed hundreds of times, finding the intercostal space by feel, the space between ribs that's narrower than most people think, the landmark that separates a save from a fatality. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She's done this in a convoy with mortar fire landing 200 meters away. She can do this under fluorescent lights. Needle decompression, she says, and someone hands her the angiocath before she finishes the word. Dr. Caldwell is shouting from 6 feet away about proper procedure, about credentials, about lawsuits and licensing boards and the proper chain of command. He might as well be screaming into a hurricane. Hannah finds the space. She feels the resistance of the skin, the give of the fascia, the moment the needle enters the pleural space. There's a rush, a sound like a tire deflating, the hiss of air escaping, pressure releasing like someone finally exhaled after holding their breath for an eternity. The monitor chirps. A rhythm appears on the screen. Thready and weak, but there. That's the moment everything changes, though Hannah won't understand how much for another few hours. The patient's eyes flutter open. There's morphine in his system, probably, but his grey eyes seem to focus for just a moment on the person standing above him. His lips move. The oxygen mask makes it almost impossible to hear, but the word comes out clear enough to carry weight. Major Clarke. Quiet. Just a whisper. But the MP standing closest to the stretcher's head hears it perfectly, and his entire posture shifts. He looks at Hannah like he's just realized he's been in the same room as a ghost the whole time. His hand comes away from his weapon and moves to his collar, a small gesture of respect toward someone he now recognizes as operating at a rank he'd forgotten she carried. Dr. Caldwell's head snaps toward her. His eyes narrow. Not because he understands what's happening, but because he recognizes that something has shifted in the chemistry of the room, that whatever authority he'd stripped from her yesterday has suddenly become irrelevant in the presence of something older and deeper and infinitely more dangerous. Hannah steps back. She pulls off her gloves with precise, economical movements. She doesn't look at anyone. He's stable for OR transport. Thoracic will need to assess for surgical drainage. 2 units O-negative concurrent with transport. Get him out of my bay. The last sentence isn't about the patient. It's a command to clear the space, and the entire trauma team moves to obey. She walks back toward triage. She can feel Dr. Caldwell's stare burning into the space between her shoulder blades, the weight of his attention like a physical force. She knows exactly what he's thinking because she's seen it before in other men who suddenly understand they've been pointing a gun at something that can point back. The problem with secrets is that once they're spoken aloud, even in a morphine-hazed whisper, they're not secrets anymore. By the time Hannah reaches the triage station, her hands are steady. The faded unit patch is still sewn inside her scrub jacket lining, right where it's been for 7 years, and no one has ever asked what it means. Now someone will. The phone call started at 2:47 in the afternoon. Dr. Caldwell stood in his office with the door closed, his voice smooth as surgical steel as he worked through his contact list. First call, the board's chief financial officer, a man who'd approved Caldwell's 6-figure salary increase 6 months prior. Second call, the hospital's legal counsel, who owed him a favor after he'd testified favorably in a malpractice case. Third call, the nursing director, who understood that her budget approval depended entirely on his goodwill. By the time he hung up the last phone, Hannah Clarke's fate was sealed into institutional machinery that didn't require his presence to execute. He didn't need to lift another finger. The system would do it for him. By 3:15, Hannah was pulled from triage. The charge nurse, looking uncomfortable, delivered the message in the break room where Hannah was organizing supplies. You're reassigned effective immediately. Inventory management. Basement level, storage and stock rotation. Hannah set down the pen she'd been holding with the careful precision of someone whose hands had learned to remain steady when the ground shifted. Why? The charge nurse couldn't meet her eyes. Staffing adjustment. Dr. Caldwell's orders. Hannah nodded once and clipped her badge to her waistband without another word. The basement smelled like cardboard and industrial bleach, fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly white that turned her scrubs the color of bone. She counted compression bandages, arranged for stands in neat rows, moved boxes that weighed nothing compared to the weight of understanding exactly what had just happened. Her regular nursing team, the ones who'd watched her move through Saturday's crisis with the grace of someone who'd done it 100 times before, was scattered like papers in a wind. Chen transferred to the night shift on pediatrics. Marcus pulled to urgent care. Rodriguez rerouted to orthopedic post-op on the 3rd floor. Within 90 minutes, the 4 people who might have testified to her composure, her expertise, her absolute adherence to protocol before the arrest code were positioned where they couldn't defend her. She'd worked with these nurses for 3 years. They hadn't done this by choice. The orders had come from above, implemented by middle management trying to survive in an atmosphere that had suddenly become dangerous to breathing. Hannah understood the calculus. She didn't blame them. She'd served under worse than this and survived, but understanding didn't make the isolation less cold. But that wasn't the worst part. At 4:30, her badge was reprogrammed. She tried to access the ICU where the general recovered under MP guard, a man whose life depended on post-operative monitoring in the next 12 hours, and her card was rejected with a soft beep and a red light. The security system was tighter than a lockdown protocol. She stood in the hallway outside the ICU doors, watching through the glass partition as monitors beeped in steady rhythm around the recovery beds, unable to cross the threshold. A young nurse she didn't know stood at the general's bedside, checking lines. The uniform on the Marine stationed at the door never so much as glanced at her. Muscle memory wanted to move her forward anyway, that old Marine training that said you completed the mission regardless of obstacles, but this wasn't the battlefield. This was a hospital where she no longer had clearance to save a life. The realization settled into her chest like shrapnel. Dr. Caldwell's next move came at 5:10 when security was called to escort Hannah to his office. The chief of emergency medicine sat behind his desk like a general claiming territory, her personnel file spread open before him like evidence at a court-martial. 2 board members flanked him, their presence transformed the conversation into something formal, something with legal weight. The lighting in the office was cool and institutional, the kind that made everyone look slightly ill. Hannah stood rather than sit, her posture the same as it had been 1,000 times in 1,000 debriefing rooms. "Your employment application, Nurse Clarke," Caldwell began, sliding a paper across the desk with a fingertip. "Education. Certifications. Previous employment. You failed to disclose prior military service." Hannah's eyes moved to the document without her moving anything else. Her voice, when she spoke, could have cut diamonds. The application didn't require it. "I listed all relevant nursing credentials." Caldwell smiled, that smile like a predator recognizing weakness in prey, except the weakness was his, not hers, and she was the only one in the room who knew it. "This is practicing medicine without a license. Saturday, in the trauma bay, you performed a needle decompression and applied an improvised chest seal without physician supervision. That's a federal violation. That's grounds for immediate termination." He leaned forward. "Furthermore, this 3-year employment gap suggests you were hiding something. Perhaps a dishonorable discharge? Perhaps incompetence in a previous role? Your failure to disclose raises questions about your integrity." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. His name was Thompson. He'd thanked Hannah personally 6 months ago when she'd caught a medication error that would have killed a patient in his department. He said nothing now. The silence in the room was like a held breath before a detonation. Hannah took one measured breath. She'd been trained to survive captivity, interrogation, and the kind of psychological warfare that made this boardroom look like a children's game. She could hold herself together through anything except this, the knowledge that the system itself had been weaponized against her, that Caldwell had won before she ever opened her mouth, that the truth didn't matter when power was what controlled the narrative. A single tear escaped down her cheek, precise as a drop of rain on window glass. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, not in front of them, she thought, not where it looks like weakness. She held the moment. Let it breathe. Then, "I saved that man's life today." Her voice was steady as a metronome. "I've served this hospital with honor for 3 years. My record will confirm that." Caldwell's smile broadened. "Security will escort you out. Your final check will be mailed." He turned away as if she'd already ceased to exist. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and rain beginning to fall like a judgment on the city. Hannah found herself in the basement parking garage at Seattle General, sitting in her 5-year-old Honda Civic with the engine dead because she couldn't bring herself to turn the key and drive toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. Her head rested on the steering wheel. The faded unit patch inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs through the scrub fabric, pressed against her heart, really, all she had left of the person she used to be. 12 years of service. 3 combat tours. 2 nations' worth of scars she'd never explained to a single colleague. A medical discharge for spinal shrapnel that gave her chronic pain on low-pressure days. And now this, unemployed, licensed nursing credentials under review, her integrity questioned by a man who'd spent 48 hours trying to destroy her because she was competent and he was afraid of competence. She couldn't move. Couldn't think beyond the percussion of rain on the roof. Couldn't hold herself together anymore, couldn't maintain the discipline that had become her second skeleton, the framework that let her walk upright when every other part of her wanted to collapse. In Tikrit, she'd held an aid station alone for 6 hours with 18 Marines rotating through in various states of catastrophic injury, making decisions that meant some lived and some didn't, and she'd held herself together with nothing but training and necessity. This was worse because this was peacetime, because this shouldn't be happening, because there was no enemy to fight except the institutional machinery she'd trusted to be better than this. The knock on her window made her jump violently, heart rate spiking, combat reflexes almost making her reach for a weapon that wasn't there. Her 17-year-old son, Marcus, stood in the dim fluorescent light of the parking garage, soaked through with rain, wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big for his lean frame. He held a small box under his arm, cardboard darkened by moisture. She unlocked the door with trembling fingers and he slid into the passenger seat, water dripping onto the upholstery, breathing hard as if he'd run here. He was still in his school uniform under the oversized jacket. "How did you?" Hannah started, but he cut her off with the kind of gentle decisiveness that made her realize, in that moment, that he was no longer a child and she'd somehow missed the transformation. "I found them in the attic 2 hours ago," Marcus said. He opened the box with careful hands. Inside are her dress blues, pressed and preserved in plastic for 7 years, the fabric still the precise shade of green that only the Marines used. Her medals pinned in order, a purple heart with oak leaf cluster. A bronze star with a V for Valor. And below them both, the ribbon that made the box feel sacred, the Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, hanging like a promise of something she'd earned and buried so deeply that sometimes she forgot it existed. Her service record in an official folder. Discharge papers. "I know you don't talk about it," Marcus said quietly. His voice had that careful tone, the one he'd learned to use when speaking to his mother about hard things. "I know you wanted to leave all that behind. But Mom, they fired you. For saving someone's life. They need to know who you are." Hannah reached for the box, reached for the uniform she hadn't worn since the hospital discharge ceremonies 7 years ago, and for the first time in 48 hours, her composure fractured completely. Not because she was weak, but because her son had understood what she couldn't say, that sometimes the only way to fight back wasn't to stay quiet. Sometimes the quiet ones had to speak. Sometimes the faded patch sewn inside a jacket needed to be seen in the light. "We should go to the hospital," Marcus said. "Tomorrow. The board meeting. They need to see these." Hannah nodded slowly, looking at the medals glinting in the dim light, at her dress blues folded like a future waiting to be lived again. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming against the parking garage ceiling like the rotors of a helicopter she'd once flown under, carrying wounded Marines to surgery, carrying her toward a life she'd thought was finished. She was wrong about that. Some chapters, it turned out, weren't closed. They were just waiting for someone brave enough to reopen them. The hospital board meeting reconvened at 10 in the morning, sunlight cutting through the conference room windows like a knife through surgical gauze. The polished mahogany table reflected the faces of administrators, legal counsel, and the hospital's chief medical officer, all of them waiting for answers that had been buried for 4 days in the basement archives of personnel records and incident reports. FBI Special Agent Thomas Graves sat at the head of the table, a folder thick as a medical textbook open before him. He was the kind of man who moved through rooms like water finding cracks, unremarkable until he spoke, then you understood you were standing next to someone who dealt in institutional collapse. His partner, Agent Reeves, stood by the door with the patience of someone who'd waited through worse than bureaucratic meetings. Our financial forensics team identified 43 discrepancies in Dr. Caldwell's department over the past 18 months, Graves said, his voice flat and methodical. Medication count reports that don't match pharmacy records. Performance reviews altered retroactively. Personnel files with handwritten additions in a single person's script. All of it pointing to systematic falsification of records. He pulled a document from the folder. This is a signed requisition for oxycodone that Dr. Caldwell's signature doesn't match. This one does. And this one doesn't again. The chief medical officer leaned forward. Her name was Dr. Patricia Hendricks, and she'd spent 30 years building Seattle General's reputation on competence. Her jaw was tight enough to snap a suture. We also found evidence of attempted coercion, Graves continued. Phone records show Dr. Caldwell called board members who previously voted against his promotion, called them within hours of critical incidents in his department. In one case, he called to discuss a disciplinary action against a nurse 2 minutes after she questioned his treatment protocols. The conference room door opened without a knock. A 17-year-old boy in a navy dress shirt walked in carrying a leather file box, his face steady but his eyes bright with the kind of focus that comes from understanding the weight of what you're about to do. Every administrator in the room straightened. This was not scheduled. Hannah's son stood at the foot of the conference table, his voice cutting through the silence like a trumpet at dawn. My mother is Major Hannah Clarke, United States Marine Corps. The room went still. Not the polite silence of a pause. The terrible silence of a moment when the axis of a narrative shifts and everyone knows it simultaneously. Dr. Caldwell, who had been sitting 3 chairs down from the chief medical officer, rose from his seat. His jaw clenched. His face flushed from his throat upward, a crimson tide of recognition and rage and the first real understanding that his architecture of lies was not just cracking but collapsing. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. This is absurd, he managed, his voice stripped of its authority, sounding instead like something thin and desperate. She's a nurse. She falsified. She didn't falsify anything, the young man said, and his composure was his mother's composure, the kind that comes from watching someone you love maintain dignity under impossible circumstances. He placed the file box on the table. Inside were photographs of service records, medical discharge papers, commendation letters, and beneath them all, a uniform folded with the kind of precision that only comes from ceremony. The trauma nurse who'd assisted Hannah in the emergency room that Saturday night, a woman named Rachel Chen who'd watched Hannah save a life while Dr. Caldwell shouted about procedure, stood up from her seat with trembling hands. She reached for Hannah's personnel file, the one Caldwell had weaponized, the one he'd filled with his own accusation scrawled in the margins like graffiti over a masterpiece. Rachel's voice shook as she read the dates aloud, Service Entry 2009. Honorable Discharge 2021. 12 years. 3 tours. That's not something someone lies about. That's something someone leaves quiet because they're trying to rebuild. She looked at Caldwell directly. You filled in the blanks. She never lied. She just didn't volunteer information about a life that nearly killed her. The conference room door opened again. 2 orderlies wheeled in a tall man in a hospital wheelchair, his uniform crisp despite the weakness in his frame, his bearing still that of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The general who'd arrived in cardiac arrest 4 days prior moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd recently sat at the edge of the abyss and been pulled back by hands steady enough to trust. His voice was quiet, hoarse from the ventilator tube that had been down his throat 72 hours ago, but clear enough that every word landed like a round from a rifle. I know Major Clarke. I served with her in Tikrit. She earned a Navy Cross for actions under fire, extracted 3 wounded personnel from a building under active insurgent fire while returning fire herself. He paused, let the weight of that settle. She earned 2 Purple Hearts. A Bronze Star with Valor. And 4 days ago, she saved my life with nothing but an MRE packet and the kind of calm that only comes from having already walked through hell once. The general's aide wheeled him closer to the table. Major Clarke saved my life in 2015. And she saved it again Saturday night when everyone else froze. If this hospital loses her because a man with a 15-year grudge decided to fabricate accusations, then this hospital loses something it might never replace. Agent Graves didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who'd been waiting for this moment to crystallize what he already knew. He nodded to his partner. Reeves stepped forward with 2 manila folders. Based on our investigation, we're prepared to charge Dr. Marcus Caldwell with fraud, falsification of medical records, attempted forgery, and extortion. Graves' voice carried no emotion, just the flat weight of institutional accountability. The forgeries are evident. The phone calls requesting favors in exchange for support are documented. The altered performance reviews are in handwriting analyses. And the attempted frame job against Major Clarke is so thoroughly documented that we're recommending felony charges. Caldwell's hand went to the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. His face went the color of old concrete. He looked around the room like a man watching his entire world contract into a single point of collapse. These were people he'd cultivated. Board members he'd called in the middle of the night. Administrators he'd charmed at hospital galas. And every single one of them had moved away from him by perhaps 6 inches, not much, but enough to communicate that his gravity had reversed. "You can't," he said, and his voice had become something that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I was trying to protect the department's integrity. She violated." "You altered her file," the chief medical officer said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd just understood that she'd nearly let a man with a vendetta destroy a competent officer. "You added accusations that don't appear in the original documentation. That's not procedure. That's fraud." Reeves stepped forward. The handcuffs clicked with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. They were stainless steel, polished, and they caught the morning light as she secured them around Caldwell's wrists behind his back. He didn't resist. He'd moved past resistance into a place beyond it, a gray zone where someone understands that the game is over and they've lost not just the match but their position on the board entirely. The perp walk became institutional legend. Caldwell, hands cuffed, was escorted from the conference room through the administrative corridor, then down the central hallway of Seattle General's emergency department, the same hallway where he'd paged Hannah as the Nightingale and heard his own mockery echo back to him in silence. The nurses' station came into view. The overhead lights hummed their fluorescent hymn. Every person who worked the morning shift was positioned as if coincidentally there, stocking supplies, reviewing charts, checking monitors. They looked up as he passed. They didn't point. They didn't jeer. They simply watched with the collected gaze of people who understood they were witnessing the moment when institutional predation met institutional accountability. Past the supply closet where he'd threatened her job over fabricated medication counts. The orderlies moving smoothly, their shoes whispering against the tile floor. Past the trauma bay where Hannah had saved the general's life while Caldwell shouted about procedure. The security team moved with the professional efficiency of people who'd done this before, but never to someone wearing a hospital ID and a chief's white coat. The glass doors of the emergency department slid open. The morning air of Raleigh hit them, warm, humid, carrying the smell of rain that had fallen overnight. The parking lot stretched before them. News vans were already positioned, cameras recording, reporters straightening their jackets for the angle that would run on evening broadcasts across North Carolina. Caldwell was placed in the back of an FBI vehicle. As it pulled away from the curb, his face was visible through the window for perhaps 3 seconds, a man who'd spent 15 years climbing a hierarchy, only to discover that the height gives you nowhere to hide when you fall. 6 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, the parking lot across town held a strip mall between a dental clinic and a laundromat. The leaseholder was a small insurance firm operating on margins that suggested they'd accept anyone willing to work minimum commission. The folding table sat outside the front entrance, positioned to catch foot traffic. Above it hung a banner, "Liability Insurance, Protect Yourself." Hannah Clarke, now Director of Emergency Medicine at Seattle General, stood at the window of her office on the 4th floor and could see it from this distance. She wasn't looking for him. The view just happened to include the commercial strip across the street from the hospital's employee parking garage. Sometimes you see what you see without looking. The man at the folding table was gaunt now, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with weight. His suit was wrinkled. His voice, audible even from this distance, had the raspy quality of someone who'd made 10,000 cold calls in 6 months and stopped believing in the script somewhere around call number 4,000. His fingers moved down a list of phone numbers. His expression carried the flat effect of someone who'd moved past anger into something more like numbness. He looked up once. Directly at the hospital. Directly at the window where she stood. His eyes met hers across the distance, 400 meters of air and glass and institutional space between them. His hand stilled on the list. For perhaps 3 seconds, they saw each other. Then Hannah turned away. Her pager buzzed. Trauma incoming. MVA on IU-40, 3 vehicles, ETA 6 minutes. She moved toward the door, her dress blues pressed sharp enough to cut, the lieutenant colonel rank on her collar catching the light from the window, the promotion that the general had kneeled to pin, the one she'd earned in Tikrit and earned again on Saturday. Her office door opened onto the hallway. The faded unit patch from Tikrit hung framed on the wall beside her desk, behind glass. Next to it was the photograph from the hospital chapel, the general on one knee, her son standing beside her, sunlight streaming through stained glass in colors that looked like victory. The ER doors slid open. The smell of antiseptic and hope filled the space. Her nurses straightened. Her residents waited. The stretchers were already rolling. The trauma team moved around her like a constellation that knew exactly where its center was, and she moved through the center like a woman who'd been trained in 14 languages of catastrophe and refused to forget a single word of any of them. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of quiet strength in the people around you, then hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because there are Hannahs working in your hospital, in your precinct, in your workplace right now, people carrying invisible decorations, maintaining impossible dignity, saving lives while the system tries to break them. And the world needs to know their names. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength? Let's talk about the heroes walking among us.